So in this podcast episode, I'm going to teach you guys how to get a suntan without getting sunburnt. So I used to live in Oregon for about 4 years because that's where I went to college. And coming from Hawaii and going to Oregon was a dramatic difference in a bunch of things. But the biggest difference was the amount of sun exposure. Or I should say, the lack of sun exposure in Oregon. So by the time we got there for school, which starts latter part of August, getting into September, things were great. And I kid you not, once, I want to say mid part of September, getting into October, I did not see the sun again till April. And I didn't really understand the profound effect of the sun and how it affected me from a physical standpoint. And I thought it was just all, because I was in school, I was getting tired. But I started to have all of these issues. I started to notice that I was having like panic anxiety attacks. My gut started to get all weird. I would have like minor signs of depression, and I didn't really realize what was going on. And I was only a freshman, I'm here 18 years old, and I have no idea what's going on. And as I got further into my studies, I started to understand the role that the sun played in your health. And that's what really got me understanding or diving into how does the sun affect our health? And now, in Oregon, or at our school, at Pacific University, in April, we always had our annual luau. And the thing that would happen every single April is that everybody that was performing in luau would try and go and get a suntan because we were ghostly looking by the time April rolled around. And we would get like this 1, maybe 2 weeks of cloud clearing, and you would see everybody out in the quad area suntanning. And for being ghostly white at the time, everybody would burn. And so you would walk into luau and everybody was red. And that was a funny memory that I knew. And now, as this podcast is being released, we're heading into spring. More people are going to be spending time outdoors. They're going to be doing like what we were doing in Oregon, trying to get some sun. And because we've been sheltered and indoors, lack of sun, maybe just over, cloud coverage, everybody's going to get burnt. Why? Because everybody's going to try and do too much. They want to get tan yesterday. They want to get beach body ready yesterday. So they're out in the sun, and instead of staying and and creeping their way in and working their way in, like what I'm going to teach you in this podcast, they stay out. And I see this all the time here in Hawaii. We got a lot of tourists that come into Hawaii, and we go down to the beaches, and I watch them, and they're just laying out in the sun. And they get up, and they're just burnt to a crisp. And then sometimes that can be really immediately detrimental, and long-term it can be detrimental, right? So there's a lot of things that we got to be doing to help our body to get into condition to be out in the sun, and we've been accustomed to wearing sunblock, when heading outdoors, and everybody kind of understands that. But there are some things that we gotta be doing to condition our body. And the reason why we want to do that is because we haven't been exposing ourselves to the sun for a long time, especially for those that live in northern climates. If you burn yourself consistently, you predispose yourself for the 3 main types of skin cancers, which is squamous cell, basal cells, and melanomas. But the conundrum that we all face is that we need UV exposure to produce vitamin D. And I talked about this in another podcast about the importance of vitamin D. It's linked towards hormonal balance. But if we need the sun to produce vitamin D, yet if we get too much sun, then we could predispose ourselves to skin cancers. But yet we need the sun to produce vitamin D, which is an anti-cancer. You can see this catch-22 that we're in, right? This is a little conundrum here. We need the sun to produce vitamin D to prevent cancer, yet by getting sun, we predispose ourselves to possibly get skin cancer. Weird. Well, there's a reason why. We gotta condition our body, we gotta condition the skin to be exposed to the sun. Okay. So that's what we're gonna talk about in today's podcast. And I want everybody to understand that we're all solar powered. Right? You didn't see human beings slathering on sunscreen 500,000 years ago. We walked out in the sun. We hunted and gathered food out in the sun all day long because we had our own built-in, and we still do. People forget this. We have our own built-in sunscreen called melanin. So if you lived closer to the equator, you expressed higher amounts of melanin to protect against the high amounts of UV that we were being exposed to. And then as we moved out of the equatorial regions towards the northern latitudes and the southern latitudes, then we didn't have a need for melanin. We actually decreased the melanin expression, in those northern and southern latitudes so that we could get the benefit of UV radiation to create vitamin D. But our natural inbuilt-in sunscreen is melanin. Okay. Now, I'm not always an advocate for wearing sunblock because we still need that UV to create vitamin D. And we're going to talk about vitamin D, and I'm going to have a whole other podcast dedicated towards vitamin D and optimizing it, and why supplementing with vitamin D is not the same as producing your own vitamin D or getting it from a food source. We're going to talk about that in another podcast episode. So let's jump right into it. What do we do? First step I always recommend for people is just get your vitamin D levels tested. It's very simple and it's very inexpensive to get your vitamin D levels tested. And you can get this from most labs. I know that there's a lab called Everlywell. They sell theirs right now. I think it's like $49. So get your vitamin D levels tested. Now, caveat to that, they're testing the inactive form, but it gives us something, right? It gives us something to look at and base, that just gives us our baseline. So that will then inform us, okay, if there's low levels of inactive, then I can guarantee you there's low levels of inactive. So we can infer from that. But this is a good place to start. Get your vitamin D levels tested. Okay. And optimally, we want it somewhere over like 45, 55. We want it somewhere above that. I've seen some patients, they're actually in the hundreds. Pretty phenomenal. But the majority of the patients that I see are sub 20. In the teens, I've seen some people 3, 4, very, very low. And, they have the accompanying health issues that comes along with that. So first step, get your vitamin D levels tested. Then next one is you're going to download an app called D-Minder. What this does is it makes things a little bit simpler because the one question that I always get from people is, well, how long should I stay out in the sun? And what this app does for you is it takes into account where you are on the earth. It tracks your geographical location, and then it computes what is your UV index exposure currently according to the day and the time. And then it tells you, according to your skin type and how much skin is being exposed to the sun, it tells you how long you should stay in the sun. So it gives you an estimate of how long you should stay in the sun. And it has like little alarm that will tell you, you've reached your maximum point, consider stopping your exposure. And then you can choose to ignore it, or you can choose to obey it. But it gives you a a good heads up of, hey, you've reached your maximum exposure for today. Because a lot of times what we've done is we've gone out into the sun and we just go to the point where we feel like, yeah, that's enough. And a lot of times we end up getting burnt. We may not see ourselves being burnt right then and there. We get home that night, next day, you're burnt. So what we want to do is we want to slowly increase, and we're going to talk about this in the next couple slides on what to be doing about that. Anyways, so the DMinder app will inform you on your length of how long you should be out in the sun. And then in the previous episode, I talked about the circadian rhythms and when to time your exposure for your sun. We want to, for those that are just starting out, we want to use the bookends of the day. So morning time sun exposure and afternoon, evening time sun exposure. That's where we want to start with. Middle of the day, we want to limit our time outdoors, just because that's the time when if you spend a lot of time out there and you're gonna get burnt. Okay, so just note that. Now we want to develop that solar callus. Okay, this is how we start to condition the skin to sun exposures, and as we do this, it allows you to stay out in the sun longer, and it allows you to not get burnt. Okay. So what you're going to do, like I said, condition yourself, get morning and evening sun exposures, and you can use the DMinder app during that time, and it'll tell you, yay, the UV index right now is 3, 4, and it'll give you a time frame of how long you can stay out in the sun during that time. A good trick that you can do is using a red light panel before you go out and after you get out of the sun. This starts to condition the skin even more. If you don't have a red light panel, you can go to the description and in the or the link in the or if you don't have a red light panel, you can go to the description below or in the show notes, and there'll be a link to the red light panels that I currently recommend. Another thing you can do is taking a cold shower before and after sun exposure, because what that's going to do is stimulate circulation. And what the circulation is going to do is bring red blood cells, and red blood cells will absorb a lot of the UV, and it'll start to stimulate the production of melanin and also decrease the amount of inflammation that's going on as well. So like I said, you shouldn't be out in the sun to the point where your skin gets burnt. Right? For some people, if you are fair skinned, 5 minutes you can get burnt, especially if you have a UV index over 6. Okay, so just note that you don't have to go out for a long time. Okay? So you want to start slow and then increase over time. Again, minding yourself that you're not getting burnt. Now, one of the things that I do recommend when you're doing this is to make sure you're not wearing sunglasses, prescription glasses, contacts, anything that's blocking UV from hitting your retina, because you need the UV radiation to hit your retina. Right? There's photoreceptors within the retina called melanopsin, and they yoke the skin and the retina together to enhance the production of vitamin D and the developing of your solar callus. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're not blocking the light that's hitting your retina and having a disproportionate amount of hitting your skin. They have to be the same. You guys are going to get sick and tired of hearing this from me, but you got to optimize the gut health. And the reason being is, in a previous podcast, I talked about the microbiome and vitamin D production. So if we don't have a proper functioning microbiome, we're not going to have adequate levels of vitamin D. The gut microbiome is an integral player, right? Very integral player for the vitamin D production. So getting a diet rich in prebiotics, probiotic foods, so fermented foods that have soluble fibers, resistant starches. All of those things will help to optimize the gut microbiome, get it more the microbiome being more diverse, because you need that diversity to increase vitamin D production. And in the previous podcast, I talked about a study that showed that. Okay? And the gut microbiome is one of the first steps in vitamin D metabolism. So it goes from an inactive form to its active form, and then just gets recycled into the enterohepatic circulation. And the gut microbiome is regulating calcium absorption as well, which plays an integral part in vitamin D. But as you guys are going to see later on at the end of this, I talk about some troubleshooting tips of what happens maybe if you get hives or welts, or like sun rashes. All of those is an integral part that the gut plays in that. So there's a lot of research studies, and I listed just a few here. The Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism showed that if you supplemented with Lactobacillus reuteri, that it would actually increase the vitamin D levels in your blood, because what that probiotic does is it increases the expression of the genes that's involved in vitamin D metabolism. Pretty phenomenal stuff. There was another study in the Journal of Investigative Medicine, and they found that the gut microbiome plays a crucial role in vitamin D absorption and utilization. So this is very important, especially in the northern climates when you don't have a lot of sun exposure, but you still need adequate amounts of vitamin D circulating within the blood. And this is why, when a lot of people, they talk about vitamin D supplementation. I'm like, I don't know about that, because it's not the same thing as getting it from the sun and also getting it from the food. And we're going to talk about that in the vitamin D episode. So now, if you have to be outdoors for longer periods of time, now you want to consider sunblock. So you want to get sun first, get the skin conditioned. And then if you have to be out longer, then use sunblock methods. I would start with sunblock clothing. So SPF clothing, different covering options, long sleeve hats. You can put on sunglasses then, but I would use sunblock as a last line. Okay? And if you are going to use sunscreen, my favorite one to use is Raw Elements. Their handle is Raw Element USA. You can go to their website, Raw Elements, and when you start using it, it's not like your typical sunscreen. This is a little thicker, and it's a little bit different than your typical sunscreen. But one, you're not poisoning yourself, and two, you're not poisoning the reefs. And especially if you're coming to Hawaii, we got to protect our reefs. So note of that. Here are some foods that can help prevent sunburn. I listed out a bunch of foods and the links as well that show that the studies have shown that these foods can help prevent sunburn. So stuff like tomatoes, watermelons, grapes, green tea, cacao, berries, like strawberries, raspberries, cranberries, and anything that has astaxanthin. So stuff like shrimp, crab, salmon, microalgae are very high in astaxanthin. And astaxanthin is one of the biggest players for preventing sunburn. And it's also a really great antioxidant, good for your eyes as well. But if you're utilizing these foods and all the rest of the things that I've been teaching you, you're going to prevent the sunburn from occurring. So let's move on to some troubleshooting tips, some things you may run into when you start implementing these things. I know a lot of patients, when they start going out into the sun and they haven't been out in the sun for a while, they've experienced either like sun rashes, hives, welts, or just getting burnt very easily because their skin's not accustomed to it. Typically, this is involved with an imbalance between calcium in the tissues and essential fatty acids. So a lack of essential fatty acids like DHA is a really big one. And if we run a test called the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio test, we often see that this ratio is higher than it should be. And some patients, though, their levels will be like 15 to 1. Some are 20 to 1. We want to see it under like 5 to 1, 4 to 1. Those are the most optimal levels of omega-6 to omega-3. When it's above 10, 15, 20, you are in a pro-inflammatory state. So now whenever you go out into the sun or anything else, but especially if you go out into the sun, your body is going to be in a hyper-inflammatory state. So if you are burning easily, you have a lot of hives, welts, sun rashes, you are probably high in omega-6s. So we got to take some time to decrease that omega-6 count, from the foods that you're intaking, and also increase the omega-3s that you're intaking. We also want to look at the balance between the calcium and the essential fatty acids. And like I alluded to earlier, there's more of a deficiency in the essential fatty acid portion. So this ties into the omega-6, omega-3 to where you need to increase the amount of DHA that you're getting. So stuff like oysters, small fatty fishes, all of those things that contain high levels of DHA will help your body to adjust to getting the sun and not getting burnt as easily. Now, some patients, they may go out into the sun a lot. You may live towards the equatorial regions and you may get a lot of sun, and you'll run a vitamin D test and you'll see, well, my vitamin D levels are still low. And some people are confused by this. I have a lot of patients that have done this. They just can't wrap their heads around why their vitamin D levels are so low. And one of the primary reasons we find is that their skins are not hydrated enough, because you need a properly hydrated skin in order for vitamin D to form from the UV exposing the skin being exposed to the UV radiation and cholesterol binding with that UV and creating this prohormone, where vitamin D is now becoming a prohormone to become activated in the liver and then in the kidney as well. But it all starts within the skin, and if the skin's not hydrated enough, then it's very difficult for cholesterol and UV to become that prohormone. So we got to make sure that we're hydrating our skin properly. Now, the easiest way that people are getting dehydrated is that they're in a high non-native EMF environment. And what this does is it dehydrates your skin, right? If you think about if you've ever used a microwave and you put like a steak in it, the steak will come out dry. If you use chicken or whatever protein that you put in the microwave, you find that it will come out dry. And what's happening in the microwave is that the protein is being dehydrated and it just becomes leathery. So this is what happens to your skin as well. If you are in a high non-native EMF environment, your skin's being dehydrated, you go out into the sun, and you just don't make enough vitamin D from the UV exposure. Now, another one that I didn't talk about earlier was that vitamin D supplementation can also decrease the amount of vitamin D you produce, because the body thinks that it doesn't need to make it. So this is why I'm not a very big proponent of taking like synthetic vitamin D forms. I mean, on a lab test, it may show that you've actually increased your vitamin D levels if you've had low vitamin D levels, but you're not allowing your body to make the proper amounts of vitamin D. And in actuality, the best form of it is being from the sun. So some reasons why you may have low levels of vitamin D is that you're not hydrated enough, but also if you're taking vitamin D, the synthetic forms, you most likely will not make enough vitamin D. And you'll see this if you take a lab test and your vitamin D levels may be low, even if you're being exposed to the sun. Now, some medications can actually make you more sensitive to the sun, right? We've seen this in patients where that they're taking some type of antidepressant, or like St. John's wort, they tell you not to go out into the sun because you may be more photoreactive. So I put out a list here, and if you're listening on the podcast, you may want to go to the YouTube channel, and there's a whole list of these medications that if you're taking it could make you more sensitive. And we found a bunch of patients where they say, I tell them you need to increase your sun exposure. And they did not disclose that they were taking some of these medications, or they didn't think that these medications were worth disclosing because they were some of them were over the counter, and they didn't know that it would react with sun. So things like antibiotics, diuretics, NSAIDs, retinoids, antidepressants, antipsychotics, and even oral contraceptives. All of these will have an impact on how sensitive you are to the sun and may make you more prone to being sunburned. Now, what if you do get burnt? You go out and maybe you've done some of these things or maybe you haven't. What do you do if you get burnt? Well, there's a couple things that I list here that you can implement if you get burnt. Okay? And a lot of you guys know some of the more common things, using stuff like aloe vera gel, or any type, like a cooling rag or whatever. But if you can increase your intake of astaxanthin-rich foods, that will help to decrease that inflammatory reaction in the body. Red light therapy, that's like my go-to. You gotta be using red light therapy. If you haven't invested in one as of yet, go to the link in the description or in the show notes, and there's a link to the red light panels that we use. Taking collagen supplements can also help. Grounding, because grounding will just decrease the amount of inflammation in your body. And then also topical CBD oil. I did a whole podcast episode with Dr. Monaco talking about CBD oil, and she has a really great line. So go and check out that episode where we talk about CBD oil and all of its anti-inflammatory properties. So I hope this was very informative for you, and you got something out of it. And I want you guys to take away that we need to have sun exposure, right? The different doctors around, for the last 70, 80 years have really demonized getting sun exposure. And I want to tell you guys that's an improper thing. We need to be getting sun exposure for optimal health benefits, because that's one of the things that just drives cellular function. So now you understand that, and I went through all of the things that you need to be doing and some of the steps that you should be doing. We're coming into summer. We got to be doing these things for overall optimal health. So I hope this helps. If it did, share this, with all your friends and family. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button. If you're not following on the podcast, follow the podcast. And if you do feel inclined to, leave us a 5-star review. That's how we can grow this and all that kind of stuff. And if you're not following me on Instagram, follow me on Instagram. I post a lot of my stuff there. I'm also on, all the other socials, TikTok, Twitter. You can find me pretty much anywhere. My handle is usually always Triple Play Doc. Yeah, I think all of them are all Triple Play Doc. So you can find me anywhere. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Till the next time, be well and aloha.